we might get a start. So I guess the session that everyone's been waiting for. Good morning, everyone, and hopefully you've been enjoying the day so far. Thanks again, Keenan, for a very informative session earlier on our economic outlooks and how they may impact LGAs now and into the future as we work with our communities. But as in terms of today, you'd be aware we're presenting to you on a virtually a general update in relation to the LGA 2020 implementation. So you don't have to hear my voice the whole time, and there's some other critical people that have played a part in what we're presenting today. We've got Malcolm, Hannah and John, who are the subgroup leads as part of the implementation and the established working group that will take you specifically on some higher level points in relation to the documents themselves and the work that we've been able to pull together in what would be a relatively short period of time, one would say. So a bit of the agenda. I'll go through the last 12 months. We know what we've had to deal with in that 12 months. A bit of a refresher on the general direction of the Act, the methodology that we looked to implement when we were drafting up the documents, and how we pulled the working groups together to try and achieve this, as well as touch on some of the feedback we received through the Engage Week website, and then obviously the final documents that will be published online, and they'll have the links ready for everyone to see. I'll then pass over to those subgroup leads, as I said, for the financial plan with Malcolm, budget with Hannah, and then the revenue rating plan with John. Then we'll be able to finish up with some details on some future webinars that will go into a lot more detail than what we're going through today, and allow for that opportunity for some specific, I guess, interrogation or review of those documents with questions of other professional experts in the room. So, and then at the end, given the model accounts have been a separate process to the LGA implementation, I'll then pass over to Sharon Redmond that will also be touching on the documentation there. So the last 12 months, for those that may have forgotten, there's a lot that happened in 12 months. Those that follow the royal family, there was Megxit. Then there was also Brexit that finally took place as well after a lot of years of talking about it. The bushfires, I'm sure those haven't forgotten that, and followed by the smoke haze that we had in the 12-month process as well, where if I talk about Maroondah specifically, that did have an impact on us in terms of having to close leisure facilities due to the haze that was entering the facilities. So we're already starting to have that some level of impact from that event, and evidently we can't forget COVID, which we're still living with at the moment. I've intentionally dropped the 19. Apparently there's been suggestions that psychologically there's benefits to drop the 19 so that it doesn't remind people how long we're enduring it and how long further we'll be enduring it potentially. We had a change of local government minister as well. So as you can see, even just with COVID alone, those in the room here had to deal with 2 or 3 budget iterations as financial professionals, but then as human beings, dealing with the remote working and level of uncertainty as well, all plays a part in what we've had to tackle over the last 12 months. And then I guess you can't blame anyone if the Local Government Act 2020 receiving royal assent maybe wasn't on the top of the priority list after everything that we had faced. So I guess today is that opportunity to remind people and remind all our members that what some of our obligations have been, and to get us to where we are now as well. We have to remember it is the biggest legislative reform that the sector has faced in the last 30 years, and it deserves that recognition as well. So with that in mind, if you cast your mind back to the February 2020 PDD, it's probably the last one we're actually able to have as a face-to-face, where the then department came and presented at our PD Day on the LGA implementation pathway. And I remember back then talking to some of our members, even before we knew what else we would be dealing with in the coming months, how overwhelming it was going to sound to implement such a big piece of legislation in a relatively short period of time. And if you look there on the slide, we were presented with the timeframes from stages 1 to 4. And if you look back over the last 12 months, we've had a bit of a ride in terms of what we've had to achieve. And hopefully most councils have ticked off these boxes because they have been well and truly due along the way. So you can see stage 1, we've had to undertake. Stage 2, virtually all but complete as well. There's obviously the engagement components that there'll be councils at different varying stages of that process. And then stage 3A, which also a lot of those documentations, some councils would have had them in place before and needed them revised. Some may have to start from scratch, but whatever the case, it is a big piece of work, and I'm sure everyone has had some form of part to play in that process. So that brings us to 3B, which is mainly the financial components. That is what the focus of today is, and the work that's had to be undertaken in the last few months. So it's just a reminder and refresh everyone on the Act. The general, I guess, whole premise of the new Act and the associated regulations is that it's not prescriptive, and it actually provides us as councils with a bit of flexibility and adaptation, I guess, for what how we operate as organisations, rather than prescribing what we should do. And that's hence why the Act moved towards a principle-based approach with those 5 key principles listed on the slide. And the main focus of today, again, that financial management category, point 3, sub point 3 of that 5 principles. And with that little point comes a lot of work. And I guess one important point I wanted to make today is really reminding everyone it is a transitional year, and we can't expect that everything's going to be perfect in that period of time. As I mentioned earlier, councils are at different varying stages of implementing certain processes. An example of that would be the deliberative engagement process, where some councils may have adopted a policy and some may not have. And the Act does stipulate, I guess, in section 91, as an example, the financial plan does need to follow deliberative engagement practices if a council's adopted that policy already. However, there has to be some common sense applied where, you know, we're dealing with, again, tight turnaround times, and potentially through your own organisations, you may have to discuss how that may not be the case this time around, and you might be going down the old section 223 process for this year. But again, that has to be an organisational decision, as opposed to, I guess, FinPro or LGB stipulating how that should be done. But again, it's just one of those things that when you are in a transitional year, it can cause a bit of grief, but at the same time allows us to know that there is time to then refine it and improve as we go along. So with all that in mind, FinPro had put the minds together as to how we could turn around such a big workload in a short amount of time to provide the sector with some guidance. And there was thought to putting working groups together that were structured and guided with all these principles and considerations in mind. So when I look at I guess the methodology that we applied in the past, FinPro and LGB have partnered up to deliver said documentation that assists the sector in, I guess, consistency, and we thought, why not apply a similar approach? So again, FinPro and LGB partnered up. FinPro put out an expression of interest process for a Local Government Act 2020 implementation working group, and we were lucky enough to have 20 FinPro members as volunteers. So as I mentioned earlier, we all know what year we've had, yet we had 20 people put up their hand and willing to give up time in their own busy schedules to do this piece of work. And we also had Daniel O'Shea from LGB that attended all the meetings and put in his time as well. So we thank Daniel there. So we had 7 meetings across 5 months. 7 meetings doesn't sound like a lot. There were the formal meetings, and then the groups would meet informally to undertake the work that was required. Within those meetings, we then formed 3 subgroups that focused on the 3 key documentation that we'll be presenting today. And they were led by, as I mentioned earlier, Malcolm, Hannah and John, with the various groups associated with those, so that we could make many hands make light work, I guess, so that we didn't have 20 people around the table all the time. They split off and undertook the work that we needed to do. And then we also had some finance professional advice from Martin Thompson, Senior Partner at FinPro, who's a long-standing partner of ours that has helped us with the model accounts and budget in the past, and has also helped in the critique of the documentation. So just to put some names in lights, I guess, as I mentioned, it is a big obligation or commitment from individuals in the sector to put up their time. And these are all the individuals and the relating councils that assisted in putting documentation together, collaborate around the table, subgroups would meet, and then we would meet as a larger group to bounce the ideas, question particular elements of the documentation before we could put the drafts up for everyone's viewing and digesting the documentation in that regard. And you can see we had a vast variety of representation, metro, regional, etc., which was really good to achieve that that outcome. So if we move down to what happened after that, so the documentation obviously got drafted, got put up on the Engage Week website. We were dealing with quite significant time constraints. However, the documentation was able to be put up on the 10th of February and then closed for feedback on the Wednesday, the 17th of February. We took that limited consultation, meant everyone was really, really happy with the documentation, or they were distracted with the snap lockdown and Valentine's Day, and I'm not sure which one will take that. It was great documentation that was put out. So we received 8 submissions, and wherever possible, we looked to incorporate the feedback or suggestions in that in the documentation that will be presented on the website now as final. And then we also looked to, we received some general questions, I guess, along the way, post the closing of the submissions that we've answered one-on-one with those specific council reps as well. I guess if I had to talk to what is the key change as a result of the engagement, it's actually one that's been driven through LGV and FinPro, and it's actually the stripping back of the revenue and rating plan. So initially the work that the groups undertook was to have the better practice guide as well as the revenue and rating plan, but through further deliberation, it was warranted that we did not need to have a revised plan in place, as I guess the sector was looking to encourage a rating discussion in the midst of the rating review. And then given that the rating review is still an ongoing process, it's something that we should be encouraging discussion within our own organisations. And it was made quite clear from LGV that the rating system review emphasised that the system is not broken. So before we semi-prescribe what councils should do, we should really reflect that the system's working fine and refer back to the better practice guide. But John Brockway will touch on a bit of that in his slide. It's not to say that if you've gone ahead and been super enthusiastic and pulled the documentation off the consultation draft stage, that if you really like the plan, you can't use it. It's just not going to be a prescribed document, a few of those pages. So please refer to the final documentation to see what has been fully adopted. So with that in mind, where are we now? So we're in the midst, or have implemented some of the core requirements, as I mentioned, of stage 3B, and they are all those financial related models that are all in association with Part 4, Division 1 to 3 of the Act. So if you note that down, that's where you get your, I'm sure you're all across that, and that's where we've had to put our minds together to draft up the documentation. So if you see here, these will be the 3 final documents that the sector can utilise to assist them in not only complying with the new Act and regulations, but hopefully assist in adding value in their budgeting and financial planning processes. So we've got the link there to the final documents, and hopefully that gives you a good run through of where we started and how we've got to this point. Because now I'll pass on to each of the subgroup leads, starting with the financial plan and Malcolm, to go through some of the high-level changes. As we go through each document, if there's questions, we'll ask them at the end of each slide. So that's related to each particular documentation. So feel free to throw them in the chat, and I'll try to manage those with the subgroup lead. So I'll hand over to Malcolm.
Thanks, Tony. Good morning, everyone. So just a couple of points to catch on, just as we've got one slide each. So for the financial plan, the model financial plan, everyone, there are 2 documents. So there's an MS Word document and there's an Excel. So for MS Word, there's 2 components in it. So when you open the MS Word document, you'll see a bit of practice guides for about the first 12 pages. The next 24 pages is really the template that is the model financial plan that are actually used for council adoption. So if you take your virtual scissors and cut them after about page 12, I think, or page 13, you'll actually see the financial plan template, which is for about 24 pages. So that's the Word document. The Excel document, of course, is the actual Excel, which effectively is pretty close to the, or tries to mirror to the extent that it can, the model budget. So obviously filling out the numbers in the Excel document. Just for point of differentiation, we've called that the model LTFP, and we've called the Word document the financial plan. So really, it's about filling out the template, filling out the numbers in the 10-year financial plan, and then copying and pasting those into the Word template, the model financial plan. So that's the three documents. Really three things that you probably want to focus on for the purpose of this presentation. This is primarily meant to be a strategy document. Now, it covers all the compliance matters as required by the Act and the regs. The key point to note is it's a baseline strategy. We know there's a few councils out there because they've got perhaps some potential, some better resourcing, but they've already got long-term financial plan documents in place, and they're likely to use those documents on an ongoing basis and then incorporate some of the compliance matters which we've put in the model document. But this is a baseline. So in terms of a strategy document, it's a starting point and not an end point. So I want to emphasise that particularly on that first point about a strategy document. The mandatory sections you mentioned, it addresses legislative and regulatory compliance. So while it might be baseline in terms of a starting point for the strategy, hopefully it's intended to have all those mandatory sections that are necessary to comply with the Local Government Act. The third thing to remember on this is really in the context of a whole integrated framework, the financial plans designed is to funding for council plan activities out of a community vision. So councils will be going through a state or a process this stage to look at the community vision, develop their council plan. Really, it's the council plan, which are the actions to deliver services, build infrastructure. How do you fund that? Of course, it's the 10-year financial plan is how we articulate that. So there's three things to remember. It's a baseline strategy document, it's a starting point. It's designed to cover all the mandatory sections and then link into the integrated framework per the council plan and the community vision. It's probably about all I've got to cover. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Malcolm. So if there's any questions on the financial plan, happy to take them now in the chat. Otherwise, as I'll get to the last slide, there'll be opportunities in other avenues as well. But the key thing is probably really familiarising yourself with the documents as we go along. And thanks, Malcolm, for taking the lead on this one, because it was a mammoth task to do. So on with the working group. If there's no questions coming in the chat, I'll progress with the next slide where I'll pass on to Hannah with the model budget. So Hannah.
Thanks, Tony. So part of the model budget, we have two documents. So there's the Excel template, which we're all used to using, which is now to prepare the 4-year budget, as well as a model budget better practice guidance. So which includes all the regulatory requirements plus a series of guidance notes. And it also does build on last year's better practice guidance, really just updating with the changes in the new Local Government Act. The key changes from last year's model budget compared to this year's model budget, number of items there, high level changes that I've listed is really the update of language, and that's really related to the integrated planning and reporting framework. Obviously the change in the terminology used there. Update of other terminology is the use of the strategic resource plan in last year's model budget. That's all now been updated to reference the financial plan. We've removed the term annual budget to try and avoid any confusion with community. Now that it's considered a 4-year budget, we've updated that language to really reflect annual budget process or just budget. Then there's the summary of planned human resource expenditure. This was one of the major changes within the model budget. That now is across all 4 years and split by expenditure, full-time equivalent, and also gender. the 3 gender classifications being male, female, and self-described. Then the summary of planned capital works expenditure, again, one of the major changes from last year to this year, being now 4 years of capital works expenditure, the first year being detailed like we've always had, but years 2 to 4 being grouped by asset class. In addition to the better practice guidance and the model budget is some optional extras which are flagged in the model, I think on red tabs or with asterisks saying that they're optional. This really came from a number of feedback from within the working group and from the feedback on Engage Vic was around some optional extras where, you know, if councils want to provide some more information to the community, what does that look like and what is the structure of that to provide some consistency? And the 4 things that we've provided there is a CFO or executive summary, the budget influences, so both internal and external budget influences, economic assumptions, which is very much kind of drawing on what was included in the strategic resource plan of, you know, what are our assumptions around CPI, rate capping, user fees and charges, borrowings, interest rate on investments, things like that. And then the 4th one being the notes to the financial statements. So some of those tables, we felt that it wasn't specified anywhere that we needed to provide 4 years of the notes to the financial statements. However, it does provide some really good information. So if councils did want to do that, the template's there for you already set up to proceed with that. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Hannah. Any questions in relation to the budget document? Again, can have them through the chat. There was just probably raised in terms of the human resource tab, that did raise probably the most, a couple of questions after the submissions around things as simple as around splitting of gender and trying to predict what the gender split might be in future years. I guess a bit of common sense, again, it's going to be not going to be the easiest thing looking at natural attrition and then potentially strategies internally as to what might lead to that split and what that might look like. But again, it's not going to be a perfect science, but that was one of the main things that came up a number of times post consultation period. So
yeah,
there's no further questions. Thanks, Hannah, again for leading that group and getting the results there. So with that, I'll move to John and the revenue and rating plan.
Thanks, Tony. You stole a little bit of my thunder earlier, but I guess this was really dependent on the Victorian rating review. And as you stated, the big outcomes of the rating review were it ain't broke. So the rating system isn't broke. And the other thing is it clearly identifies rates as a tax. So hopefully that will remove some confusion. After the engagement period with the sector and with the government, we decided to provide a better practice guide, which is really a supplement to the 2014 Better Practice Guide model plan with updates for the new Act. As you noted as well, it is evolving. The Local Government Act 2020 is yet to be updated with the outcomes of the rating review and even possibly outcomes of the Ombudsman's report into hardship. This will mean this plan will evolve and the documentation around it will evolve in time. So I guess the focus of the revenue and rating plan is clearly the discussion justifying why your council applies rates and charges the way it does. So they really want to focus on that and have that discussion with the community. The top 3 things to remember there is that everybody does it differently. So you should not take the plan verbatim. You should add whatever is relevant to your council and delete sections that don't apply to you. The rating provisions of the 1989 Act are still in force until that update happens. And in terms of the mandatory sections, make sure you address the legislative and regulatory requirements and how it interacts with other plans that you're required to do. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, John. We've had one question in the chat from Stephen, noting that some councils do have existing rating strategies and whether councils can incorporate its current adopted rating strategies into the new documentation and defer a comprehensive rating review once the current strategy expires.
Well, the rating the revenue and rating plan really is a discussion about what you're doing for your rates, I guess, and your other revenue items. So in that situation, what you would do, you would incorporate what you're currently doing, plus add sections for the other revenue items.
Thanks, John. And thanks as well for leading that group. And obviously a lot of work that got undertaken, but some had to get pulled away, unfortunately. But it may come into use down the track. With that said, again, we're really pleased with the amount of time everyone put in and where we've got to in that period of time. Obviously, like I mentioned earlier, the documents are very detailed and we haven't really done full justice to them in this session. So we believe that some webinars, as we've done in the past with the budget and model accounts, would be quite useful. So you've got the dates on screen and the slides will be provided. So all 3 webinars will run from 12:30 till 2, and you've got the 5th of March for the model accounts and model budget, and 12th of March for the financial plan, and then 19th of March for the revenue and rating plan. All sessions will be recorded if you can't make them, and further registration details will be provided in due course through emails and members updates. If you have any questions that potentially you may think of after today or down the track, feel free to you can shoot me an email directly. Remembering that, you know, these will set us for the future for now, but, you know, it can lead to some improvement when we undertake the reviews with each year. The final documents, I've got the link again there. We'll have it in our members update, and I've put it in the chat in case people just want to copy and paste it in their browsers. So yeah, glad that we've been able to get to this point. As I mentioned earlier, the model accounts, given they weren't totally part of the implementation of the Act process, we do have Sharon Redmond from LGV, who's kindly offered her time to talk to us today in relation to general implementation considerations of the Act, but importantly, the launch of the model accounts for 2021, which have obviously been a separate engagement process to these 3 documents. So without further ado, I'll probably pass over to Sharon. I'll unshare my screen. As I said, the slides will be available, and allow Sharon to take over the screen. Just one.
Thanks, Tony, very much for the invitation and the opportunity for us to present at FinPro today. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we all meet on, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to thank and commend FinPro, and particularly the Local Government Act Implementation Working Group, for all of your efforts in developing the model budget, revenue and rating plan and the financial plan. Clearly there's been an enormous amount of work that everybody has done here in the background, and it was a little overwhelming, your first slide, Tony, in the environment that we've all been operating in the last 12 months. And it doesn't really look like that there's it's going to change anytime soon. There's still plenty of challenges and opportunities ahead for us. So we really very much appreciate the efforts of everyone involved, and everyone sitting inside councils that are working to create this environment and meet the requirements of the Local Government Act. Today, I'll give you a bit of a brief update of where we're at with implementation, and then formally launch the 2021 model accounts. So to just give you a bit of a brief, wrap up around implementation, Tony's done an awesome job around some of the things that we've already been doing and setting the context. But as you know, the Local Government Act, and I've just put 202 instead of 2020 Act, I've just noticed. It's proclaimed in 4 stages, and we're into the last year of implementation. Stages 1 and 2 are all complete, and stages 3, we're working to finalise some of the final components of that stage, particularly in the integrity reform component. So all councils should have adopted a Council of Code of Conduct on Wednesday, And, you know, as far as we know, most councils were in a position to be able to comply with that requirement. Community engagement policy is one of the key pieces underpinned by the community engagement principle, which really sets out the deliberative engagement process and approach. And oh my God, this is a disastrous today. Now my windows are being cleaned and there's window cleaners right in front of me. So community engagement policy, as I said, that will set the context of how you will engage in relation to your community vision, council plan, asset management plan, and set the context for how, you know, you will manage engagement in your various policy settings. Integrated strategic planning and reporting framework. We've spoken a lot about this to various people who will be members of FinPro. It's an area that the majority of the work that you're doing will interact, and the information that we've been talking about today has a really intrinsic relationship with the strategic planning and reporting framework. I've pulled out a couple of other things that you might be interested in that we are commencing work on. So there's a procurement policy that has, you know, some new requirements and probably a whole lot more flexibility around procurement, which will require quite a bit of thinking for councils to think about their risk appetite and their strategic positioning around what that's going to look like in establishing a good procurement framework and a good procurement policy for your council. Other things that we'll be working on, the CEO employment and remuneration policy, the workforce plan. So you guys have touched a little bit on some of the requirements within the workforce plan, within some of the work that's being embedded here. That will have a big relationship also to the Gender Equality Act as well. And then there's a complaints handling policy. So we are currently working with the Victorian Ombudsman's Office in the review of their Better Practice Guide, and, you know, really encourage councils to get involved in that and influence the way that guide will be released and what's going to be most useful to you as councils. You know, many councils receive a high volume of complaints around financial hardship, and so I'm sure that area is an interest to FinPro members. If you want to keep regularly up to date, please make sure that you register for Implementation Matters. That's a newsletter that my team send out once a fortnight. We do try and do a lot of cross promotion with FinPro, and again, thank you to Bradley and Gabby for the support in being able to do that. But if you want to see all of the elements of what we're doing in implementation, please make sure you register so that you get that information direct. So I just want to pay some respect and gratitude to the group that has been convened to work on the 2020-21 Model Account Working Group. This year's model accounts followed a similar pattern to previous years. LGV convened a working group comprising of representatives from FinPro, CPA Australia, Crow, Australasia and Vago. And a huge thanks to all of the people that are listed on the slide who participated in that working group. We know that this is over and above what is already on an enormous workload. So thanks very much on behalf of LGV for your involvement. So the process that was undertaken to review the model accounts, the working group met virtually 3 times between November and January. A survey was issued in December, which provided some really great feedback about the previous edition of the model accounts and suggested some changes and enhancements. The working group reviewed and discussed all of the survey feedback, and Crow Australasia provided some technical accounting support and resources to process and agreed changes. The key changes that have been identified in the guide, I don't need to read the screen to you, so they're covered within the material within this year's, and hopefully you see those as some really significant improvements. So all of this information is now, it has been made available on the Local Government Victoria website. There is a link here. You'll get, I understand, a copy of the link through various means through FinPro memberships. We'll also be doing some cross promotion of that through Implementation Matters later today. But also available on this web page are the report of operations, the performance statement, the performance indicator workbook, the performance reporting template, and the summary of changes document. So please make sure that you make good use of all of the resources and access via the link provided. Also, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, there is webinars planned. So I think Tony gave more dates for additional webinars, but the Model Accounts and Model Budget webinar is planned for the 5th of March. This webinar will cover the changes to both the Model Accounts and Model Budget and provide an additional forum for any questions. Really encourage you to attend and to let anybody else know in the sector that you think would be valuable to participate. Details will come out about registration, and I believe that will happen through FinPro shortly. If anyone's got any questions, really happy for you to provide them to Daniel O'Shea. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a finance expert, and so I would encourage you not to send them to me, but to please send them through to Daniel, and hopefully he will be able to answer any questions that you've got. Again, Tony, and to FinPro, to Bradley and Gab, thanks very much for the opportunity for LGV to continue to stay connected with the FinPro members and to provide regular updates on implementation as it impacts councils, and really happy to continue to be involved and answer any questions.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks for the presentation as well. And I don't see any questions floating through the chat at the moment, but I'm sure, like we said, we can receive questions at a later date as well along the way if there's none at the moment. Thanks for the presentation again, Sharon, on the accounts. And I might pass over to our president if we're done with this item. So.